What happened to Andy Leavine after the WWE Steroid test is a textbook case of corporate hypocrisy. After winning Tough Enough, he fell victim to the company's unspoken mandate requiring massive, chemically enhanced physiques. 2 months after his victory, he failed a corporate wellness test. Instead of addressing their toxic physical standards, WWE used him as a PR scapegoat. Executives quietly suspended him to maintain a clean corporate image, halted his career entirely, and silently fired him less than a year later. This is the cold reality of an industry that punishes rookies for meeting its own dangerous requirements. June 6, 2011, the Richmond Coliseum in Virginia. The atmosphere inside the arena is highly pressurized, thick with the manufactured adrenaline of a live internationally broadcast television finale. The USA Network is airing the live culmination of Tough Enough Season 5. Millions of viewers are watching as the cameras push in tight on the center of the wrestling ring. Standing under the blinding array of stadium lights is Andy Leavine. He is 23 years old, standing 6 feet 5 inches tall, and carrying over 300 pounds of densely packed muscle. He is a former collegiate offensive lineman for Florida International University, a man whose entire athletic background is rooted in the objective, measurable violence of American football. The announcer declares him the winner. He has statistically defeated the other contestants. He has secured the grand prize, a guaranteed contract with World Wrestling Entertainment. Confetti fires from the staging area, drifting down into the ring. Stone Cold Steve Austin, the host of the reality program and a heavily protected corporate icon, stands beside him, holding a microphone, officially welcoming him to the active roster. This is the exact sequence where conventional reality television narrative dictates a moment of unadulterated triumph. The music swells, the winner cries, and the corporation is presented as a benevolent entity granting a lifelong dream. World Wrestling Entertainment, however, does not operate on conventional narratives. The corporate hierarchy requires a highly visible, immediate demonstration of ownership. Vince McMahon, the billionaire chairman and absolute authoritarian ruler of the company, steps through the ropes. He walks directly toward the 23-year-old rookie. McMahon does not extend a hand in congratulation. He does not offer a word of welcome. He squares his stance, pulls his right arm back, and delivers a full-force, open-handed slap directly across Leavine's face. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh echoes audibly through the arena microphones. Leavine, operating purely on shock and the overwhelming pressure of the live broadcast, barely has time to process the physical assault before Steve Austin steps in, kicks Leavine in the abdomen, and executes his signature finishing maneuver, the stunner. The cameras pan out. The reality television season concludes not with the winner holding a trophy, but with the winner lying flat on his back, staring up at the arena ceiling, physically dismantled by the executive board. The television commentators laugh, framing the violence as a rugged, old-school initiation ritual. The audience at home consumes the imagery precisely as the corporation intended, an entertaining, albeit aggressive, welcome to the harsh reality of professional wrestling. But a forensic examination of this sequence reveals a far more insidious psychological architecture. This functioned entirely as a public subjugation rather than a rugged initiation. By physically striking a new, highly publicized employee on live television, The chairman of the board established an immediate, unchallengeable power dynamic. The slap communicated a terrifying baseline reality to Leavine, to the locker room watching backstage, and to the shareholders. It stated explicitly that the millions of fan votes and the reality television victory were entirely superficial. The contract did not grant Leavine leverage. It granted the corporation absolute jurisdiction over his physical autonomy and his human dignity. He was no longer an independent athlete. He was corporate property, and the executives reserved the right to humiliate him in front of a global audience simply to generate a compelling television graphic before the broadcast cut to commercial. The specific vulnerability of Andy Leavine in that moment was deeply rooted in the underlying business model of the 2011 Tough Enough revival. The corporation was not utilizing network television airtime to conduct a legitimate, exhaustive search for a seasoned professional wrestler. They were not scouting independent gymnasiums for technicians who possessed a decade of ring experience. The production required raw, malleable clay. They required a physical specimen large enough to fulfill the company's historical obsession with giants, but inexperienced enough to be completely dependent on the WWE apparatus. Leavine fit the demographic profile with surgical precision. His stint in professional football had ended following a brief, untelevised period in the Miami Dolphins training camp. He was athletic, imposing, and desperately searching for a lucrative avenue to monetize his physical size. When he entered the reality television environment, he was assigned a highly specific, heavily focus-grouped corporate identity. The marketing department branded him Silent Rage. Far from being an organic reflection of his personality, this moniker operated strictly as a trademarked piece of intellectual property, superimposed onto a 23-year-old civilian. The corporation recognized that Leavine did not possess the aggressive, highly theatrical verbal skills required to command a live arena microphone. Instead of allowing him to develop an authentic persona, they weaponized his quiet demeanor. They instructed him to scowl, to remain silent, and to project an aura of barely contained explosive violence. They forced him to wear a psychological mask, demanding that he portray a volatile monster for the television cameras. This preordained casting created a deadly professional trap. In the heavily guarded, highly political ecosystem of the professional wrestling locker room, a performer who relies entirely on a corporate-assigned gimmick is inherently vulnerable. The veterans of the industry possess a specific derogatory term for individuals in Leavine's position. They refer to them as being green as fresh-cut grass. Being green is not merely a critique of a performer's aesthetic presentation. It is a clinical assessment of their occupational hazard level. A green wrestler lacks the ingrained muscle memory, the spatial awareness, and the split-second decision-making required to safely execute a high-impact, choreographed combat sequence. In an industry where a miscalculated foot placement or a poorly timed rotation can result in a shattered cervical spine or a career-ending concussion, operating alongside a 300-pound, inexperienced rookie is viewed by veterans as a severe, unacceptable physical risk. The reality television format actively concealed this danger from the viewing public. During the production of Tough Enough, Leavine's training was highly sanitized. The drills were tightly controlled, edited for television pacing, and supervised by protective trainers. He was not exposed to the grueling, unpredictable reality of a 300-day-a-year touring schedule. He was not taught how to read the physiological distress signals of an opponent, how to safely navigate a botched maneuver in real time, or how to manage the chronic accumulating pain of daily canvas impacts. He was essentially taught how to perform the aesthetic outline of a professional wrestler, just enough to pass a television audition. The millions of viewers who voted for him believed they were witnessing the birth of a fully formed superstar. The veterans standing behind the curtain at the Richmond Coliseum saw a massive, dangerous liability who had just been handed a premium contract based entirely on a television edit. The slap from Vince McMahon was the ultimate physical manifestation of the reality that awaited Leavine. The confetti was a lie. The victory was a television prop. The corporation had successfully utilized a reality program to manufacture a heavily branded, physically immense product called Silent Rage. They had extracted the necessary ratings from his journey. Now they were taking this untrained, psychologically unequipped young man, placing him directly into the most unforgiving, hyper-competitive athletic environment on the planet, and demanding that he survive. The foundational business model of World Wrestling Entertainment relies on a highly specific, aggressively enforced visual aesthetic. The corporation does not market athletic agility or technical grappling as its primary commodity. It markets spectacle. Since the aggressive national expansion of the industry in the 1980s, the executive board has maintained a relentless, institutional obsession with physical size. The mandate is to present the audience with larger-than-life icons, individuals who resemble living comic book illustrations rather than functional human athletes. Within this ecosystem, sheer intimidating mass is the ultimate currency. When Andy Leavine secured his contract following the Tough Enough finale, he stood at 6 feet 5 inches tall. By civilian standards, he was an immensely large, athletically imposing individual. Within the distorted reality of the WWE locker room, however, his natural collegiate football physique was deemed entirely insufficient. The corporate machine required a monster to justify the Silent Rage moniker. The unwritten, yet heavily enforced mandate was established. Leavine needed to expand his physical dimensions to an astonishing 360 pounds. The biological cruelty of this requirement becomes glaringly apparent when placed against the physiological limitations of the human body. The human skeletal structure, the cardiovascular network, and the central nervous system are not evolutionarily designed to support 360 pounds of heavily strained muscle mass while simultaneously executing explosive, high-impact athletic maneuvers. Reaching and maintaining that specific weight class cannot be achieved through a standard regimen of grilled chicken, rice, and traditional weightlifting. It requires extreme, dangerous intervention. Leavine was rapidly transformed into a victim of a deeply toxic physical standard and an industry culture that implicitly forced the use of anabolic steroids. The corporation operates a highly sophisticated system of plausible deniability regarding chemical enhancement. The executives do not explicitly mandate the use of performance-enhancing drugs in written contracts. Instead, they engineer an environment of self-elimination. They establish a visual baseline for television employment that is biologically impossible to achieve naturally. If a performer refuses to cross the chemical line to achieve the required mass, they simply do not receive television time. They are categorized as lacking dedication, marginalized within the developmental system, and eventually terminated. The pressure to conform to this toxic body standard is absolute, forcing young athletes to quietly compromise their internal organs to secure their weekly paychecks. To build the 360-pound frame the company demanded, Leavine engaged in the brutal, joint-destroying discipline of strongman training. He abandoned traditional athletic conditioning in favor of lifting massive concrete atlas stones, pressing iron logs overhead, and hauling 800-pound tractor tires across concrete floors. This specific methodology of training is designed to maximize raw static power, but it inflicts catastrophic wear and tear on the human anatomy. The repetitive lifting of extreme awkward loads severely compresses the spinal column, grinds away the synovial fluid protecting the knee and hip joints, and places the central nervous system under a state of permanent, exhausting distress. The physical contradiction at the core of this requirement is devastating. Professional wrestling requires a performer to safely execute and absorb bumps, the industry term for falling flat on one's back onto a wooden canvas from a standing height or from the elevated ring ropes. The physics of this action are governed by a merciless equation. Kinetic energy equals half the mass times the velocity squared. When a 250-pound athlete takes a bump, the shockwave transferred into their spine and internal organs is severe. When a 360-pound athlete executes the exact same maneuver, the kinetic energy is magnified exponentially. Every night Leavine stepped into the ring to learn the mechanics of his new profession. His own artificially inflated mass became a weapon utilized against his skeletal structure. The cartilage in his knees and lower back acted as shock absorbers for an unprecedented amount of weight. Microfractures accumulated in his vertebrae. The corporate demand for a monster visual was actively destroying his functional biomechanics, accelerating the aging process of his joints by decades within a matter of months. Simultaneously, a hidden, far more lethal crisis was compounding inside his chest cavity. A 360-pound body requires a massive, continuous supply of oxygenated blood. To force blood through that much dense muscle tissue, the human heart must work at a highly elevated capacity. Under the combined stress of extreme weight, high-intensity cardiovascular exertion in the ring, and the underlying chemical requirements of the locker room culture, the heart muscle begins to hypertrophy. The left ventricle thickens, reducing the volume of blood it can pump and increasing the risk of sudden cardiac arrest. The corporation demanded an external visual of invincibility, completely ignoring the internal biological collapse required to achieve it. The true cost of this toxic physical standard does not fully materialize until the television cameras are gone and the roar of the arena fades. Years after his eventual exile from the wrestling industry, Leavine attempted to transition into a civilian career. He sought employment as a firefighter, a highly respected profession that demands elite functional endurance, the ability to climb multiple flights of stairs carrying heavy equipment, and the structural stability to rescue civilians from hazardous environments. It was a profession perfectly suited for a man with a collegiate football background. However, the body he brought to the Fire Academy testing grounds was no longer his own. It was a biologically compromised shell, permanently degraded by the requirements of World Wrestling Entertainment. During the rigorous physical examinations required by the fire department, Leavine's body completely failed him. The failure was not a lack of willpower or cardiovascular effort. It was a profound structural collapse. The years spent hauling Atlas stones to reach 360 pounds, the cartilage worn away by taking bumps under extreme artificial weight, and the overall physiological trauma of the wrestling industry had stripped him of his baseline athletic functionality. He possessed the sheer size of a monster, but he lacked the fundamental structural endurance required to perform the basic duties of a first responder. The rejection from the Fire Academy serves as the ultimate tragic receipt for his time in the reality television spotlight. The WWE executives had looked at a healthy 23-year-old athlete and demanded that he mutate his body to fulfill a temporary marketing brief. They extracted the visual intimidating presence they required for their programming, monetized his massive physique, and then left him to deal with the permanent, irreversible biological consequences. The 360-pound armor he was forced to build to survive the wrestling industry had ultimately become a physiological prison, locking him out of a viable, meaningful career long after the corporation had forgotten his name. August 2nd, 2011. A sterile 3-sentence press release is published on the corporate website of World Wrestling Entertainment. It announces that Andy Leavine has been suspended for 30 days, effective immediately, for his first violation of the company's talent wellness program. There is no accompanying press conference, no detailed explanation of the infraction, and no statement from the executives who, mere weeks earlier, stood in a television ring and crowned him the future of the industry. The corporate machine simply deployed a digital notice and severed his momentum. The sheer cynical hypocrisy of this suspension is fully exposed when dissecting the architecture of the WWE Talent Wellness Program. Implemented in the mid-2000s, following a series of highly publicized, catastrophic early deaths among its performers, the policy was heavily marketed to mainstream media and Wall Street investors as a definitive medical safeguard. It strictly prohibits the unprescribed use of anabolic steroids, human growth hormones, stimulants, and masking agents. On paper, it presents the image of a responsible, highly regulated athletic organization prioritizing the physiological safety of its workforce. In practice, the wellness policy operates as a sophisticated public relations shield and a weapon of selective corporate discipline. The system creates an insurmountable, fatal paradox for its employees. The executive board, the television producers, and the marketing department demand that performers achieve a highly vascular, unnaturally massive physique, a standard visually synonymous with the very chemical enhancements the policy explicitly bans. The unwritten law of the locker room is absolute. If you shrink, you lose your television time. If you fail to look like a comic book superhero, you are rendered economically obsolete. The corporate testing apparatus functioned less as a legitimate health initiative and more as a poverty trap. While established main event stars possessed the liquid capital to legally bypass the system through specialized physicians and therapeutic exemptions, developmental rookies like Leavine were driven into the shadows. The system was systematically engineered to punish the lowest paid laborers for lacking the wealth to legally launder the exact same chemical enhancements demanded by the executives. When a performer like Leavine, who had just destroyed his joints-hauling tractor tires to reach the mandated 360-pound monster standard, inevitably triggers a positive test, the corporation immediately executes a protocol of total isolation. They utilize the wellness policy to legally and publicly distance the corporate brand from the biological realities of their own aesthetic demands. The company absorbs none of the blame for creating the toxic environment. They transfer the entirety of the public shame and the professional consequences directly onto the independent contractor. The athlete is publicly branded as a liability, while the executives who demanded the unnatural physique maintain their pristine corporate image. The most devastating consequence of the August 2011 suspension was not the public humiliation. It was the immediate, unmitigated financial starvation. The American public fundamentally misunderstands the economic reality of a professional wrestling contract. When Leavine won Tough Enough, viewers assumed he had been handed a guaranteed multi-million-dollar fortune, akin to a first-round NFL draft pick. The reality is bound within the draconian clauses of the independent contractor agreement. WWE performers do not receive a standard corporate salary, paid medical leave, or union protections. Their income is heavily reliant on a complex matrix of downside guarantees, live event bonuses, and merchandise royalties. When the 30-day suspension was activated, the financial apparatus immediately shut down. The corporation froze his pay. The man who had just anchored a reality television franchise on the USA Network, generating massive advertising revenue and interactive voting data for the conglomerate, was suddenly sitting at home with a zero-balance incoming cash flow. He was prohibited from performing for any competing organization. He could not leverage his recent television exposure to book independent appearances. He was trapped in a state of corporate purgatory, legally tethered to a billionaire employer who was actively refusing to pay him. The psychological toll of this financial isolation is profound. Leavine was 23 years old, attempting to provide for a young family. He had uprooted his life, subjected his body to extreme physical mutation, and endured the televised abuse of the executive board, all under the strict promise of financial security. Now, less than 60 days after the confetti fell, he was struggling to purchase basic groceries. In subsequent years, long after the fear of corporate retaliation had faded, Leavine broke the industry silence regarding this specific period. He did not use sanitized diplomatic language to describe the management team. He referred to the upper echelon of the WWE Talent Relations Department as slimy and dirtbags. He detailed the staggering lack of human empathy exhibited by the corporate officers. They did not call to check on his well-being or offer nutritional and medical counseling to safely manage his physical dimensions. They simply ceased communication. He was forced to realize that to the executives in Stamford, Connecticut, he was never a human being or an athletic prospect. He was a disposable television prop. Once his immediate media value had been extracted by the reality show finale, they had absolutely no qualms about letting him financially suffocate the moment he became a mild public relations inconvenience. When the 30-day suspension officially concluded, the television audience expected the highly publicized Tough Enough winner to make a triumphant return to Monday Night Raw. They expected a redemption storyline, a narrative capitalizing on his setback. The corporation, however, had already finalized a vastly different strategy. They did not bring him back to national television. They initiated a calculated, systematic process of erasure. In the high-stakes environment of global entertainment monopolies, terminating a high-profile asset immediately after a heavily promoted reality show victory is a poor business tactic. It invites unwanted journalistic scrutiny, raises questions among shareholders regarding the validity of the reality television investment, and creates a messy public narrative. The preferred corporate strategy is exile. The goal is to remove the asset from the primary broadcast platform, strip them of their momentum, and hide them in a secondary market until the audience completely forgets their existence. Once the public amnesia is absolute, the contract can be quietly allowed to expire without generating a single headline. Leavine was initially sent down to Florida Championship Wrestling, the company's untelevised developmental warehouse in Tampa. He was stripped of the Silent Rage moniker, stripped of the main event presentation, and forced back into the grueling, anonymous routine of developmental drills. He was taking high-impact bumps on wooden canvases in front of 50 people in a sweltering Florida armory, entirely disconnected from the mainstream WWE audience. The mechanics of this Florida exile heavily relied on a ruthless corporate human resources strategy formerly known as constructive dismissal. When a corporate entity desires the termination of a highly publicized asset, but wishes to avoid the public relations fallout or potential breach of contract litigation associated with a direct firing, they systematically engineer a workplace environment so hostile, physically dangerous, and psychologically intolerable that the employee is forced to voluntarily resign. The primary instrument of this constructive dismissal strategy in 2011 was the head trainer of the developmental system, Bill DeMott, operating with the absolute tacit approval of the WWE Executive Board. DeMott administered a training protocol that completely bypassed athletic development in favor of sheer physical trauma. DeMott's operational methodology, which would eventually be exposed in a massive industry scandal, detailing verified allegations of trainees being struck while concussed, subjected to homophobic degradation, and forced into highly dangerous punitive drills, was a known sanction variable within the corporate architecture. By assigning Andy Leavine to this specific facility, the executives in Stanford effectively placed a bounty on his endurance. As a reality television winner, Leavine arrived carrying the ultimate locker room stigma. DeMott and the developmental coaching staff viewed his presence as an insult to the industry's archaic traditions and targeted him with concentrated malice. The daily training sessions were weaponized. Leavine was not taught the intricate ring psychology required to succeed on the main roster. He was subjected to endless repetitive sequences of high-impact falls onto the unyielding canvas. These sessions were specifically designed to accelerate the degradation of his already compromised 360-pound skeletal structure. The corporation had brilliantly outsourced its hostility. If Leavine quit to escape the daily physical battery, the executives could cleanly void his contract under the pretense of a voluntary resignation. If his body catastrophically failed under the strain of DeMott's punitive drills, he could be medically disqualified without severance. Operating completely outside the parameters of a legitimate school, the developmental warehouse functioned as a legally insulated corporate black site designed to physically break the reality star into submission before his contract required a financial renewal. The corporate hierarchy then intensified the isolation. In late 2011, they shipped him out of the continental United States entirely. They arranged for him to perform for the World Wrestling Council, WWC, in Puerto Rico. Within the geopolitics of the professional wrestling industry, the Caribbean circuit is notorious. It is an incredibly rugged, physically unforgiving territory. The WWC operates far outside the polished, highly regulated, brightly lit environments of American arena tours. The crowds are fiercely partisan, the rings are famously unforgiving, and the backstage environment is a relentless grind of localized politics. WWE frequently utilized Puerto Rico as a dumping ground, a remote location to park problematic talents, stalled projects, or individuals the company was actively attempting to hide from its domestic fan base. For Leavine, the assignment to Puerto Rico was the definitive signal that his mainstream career had been covertly terminated. There were no USA Network cameras documenting his matches in Bayamon. The millions of viewers who had utilized their smartphones to vote him into power had no access to his current performances. He was effectively operating in a media black hole. The psychological warfare of this exile is designed to break the employee's spirit, forcing them to either quit out of sheer frustration or quietly accept their diminished status. Leavine spent months flying back and forth to the island, enduring the grueling travel schedule, sustaining the physical damage of the heavy matches, and waiting for a main roster call-up that the corporate executives had already decided would never come. He was trapped in a holding pattern, executing the physical labor of a professional wrestler without any of the promised exposure or financial reward. This silence was not a passive administrative oversight. It was a highly calculated, ruthlessly executed psychological weapon. The sudden transition from being the focal point of a multi-million-dollar media campaign where every movement, meal, and drop of sweat was filmed, analyzed, and broadcast to millions, to absolute crushing invisibility is a specific form of mental destruction. When an individual is inside the television bubble, the corporation provides a relentless schedule, a dedicated production team, and the manufactured illusion that they are the absolute center of the universe. When the order for exile is issued, that entire structural support system evaporates instantly. The phone that previously rang at all hours with calls from talent relations and television producers goes entirely dead. Emails sent to the executive board inquiring about future creative plans are met with a cold, impenetrable void. Panic begins to set in as a 23-year-old wakes up every single morning in a quiet apartment, completely unsure if he is still a contracted television star or an unemployed civilian, watching his bank account slowly drain. The corporation weaponizes this invisible isolation. They no longer need to physically strike him in the ring or publicly humiliate him on a broadcast. They simply lock him in a state of indefinite waiting, severing all lines of communication, and allow the crushing weight of self-doubt to erode his mental stability. The true cruelty of the entertainment monopoly is not found in the roar of an angry crowd. It is found in the exact moment the executives who promised you the world decide to aggressively ignore your existence, forcing you to internalize the failure while they actively scout for your replacement. The strategy of silent discard reached its inevitable unceremonious conclusion in April 2012. Exactly 10 months after winning the grand prize on live television, Andy Leavine's developmental contract expired. The WWE Public Relations Department did not issue a statement. The website did not post an article wishing him well in his future endeavors. The internal roster sheet was simply updated, and his name was deleted from the database. The erasure was absolute. At 24, Leavine was thrust back into the civilian workforce entirely empty-handed. Unlike professional athletes in major sports leagues who retain union pensions or severance packages, Leavine's independent contractor agreement absolved WWE of any ongoing medical or financial responsibility. He was treated as industrial waste, quietly swept out by a machine already searching for the next naive rookie. The massive physique WWE had demanded was no longer a corporate asset, but a heavy biological debt that actively repelled conventional employment, leaving him to navigate the harsh economics of survival alone. Prospective employers saw a massive, intimidating figure whose primary documented work experience consisted of participating in highly aggressive, simulated combat. They did not see the quiet, disciplined collegiate athlete underneath. The corporate branding of his television persona acted as a permanent, invisible barrier, actively preventing him from securing the basic entry-level positions required to feed his family. The physical pain compounded this economic isolation. The damage inflicted by the strongman training and the daily ring bumps did not disappear when the contract expired. He was dealing with degraded cartilage, microfractures, and extreme joint compression, but he lacked the elite health insurance required to treat these conditions. Every ache and sharp pain was a daily physical reminder of the corporation that had exploited him. He was effectively paying the medical cost for the television ratings WWE had already sold to advertisers. This was not a graceful exit from the spotlight. It was a desperate, untelevised scramble to survive the severe biological and financial deficit the company had deliberately engineered. The psychological decompression required after surviving the reality television and professional wrestling machinery is a brutal, entirely unguided process. When a human being has their entire identity dismantled, rebuilt as a corporate trademark, broadcast to millions, and then abruptly terminated, the resulting silence is deafening. For Andy Leavine, the expiration of his contract in the spring of 2012 marked the beginning of a profound, agonizing detoxification. He was 24 years old, standing in the ruins of a highly publicized dream, burdened with a biologically degraded body and a mind heavily conditioned to equate personal value with corporate validation. The immediate challenge was physical deconstruction. The corporation had demanded a 360-pound monster, forcing Leavine to stretch his skeletal structure and cardiovascular system to the absolute breaking point. Away from the toxic aesthetic demands of the locker room, that massive frame was a severe occupational and biological liability. The failure to pass the Fire Academy physical examination served as a terrifying wake-up call. It provided undeniable empirical proof that the wrestling industry had not merely used his body, It had fundamentally compromised his functional health. Leavine initiated a grueling process of reversing the physical mutation. He had to shed the massive artificially accumulated bulk, stepping away from the joint-destroying strongman routines and adopting functional, sustainable conditioning. This was not a standard fitness journey. It was an act of physical reclamation. He was slowly dismantling the silent rage costume, pound by pound, attempting to retrieve the baseline athletic health that the corporate executives had demanded he sacrifice for their television ratings. The psychological reclamation proved far more complex. The professional wrestling industry operates as an insular high-control group. It systematically conditions its performers to believe that the wrestling ring is the absolute center of the universe, and that life outside the corporate hierarchy is inherently meaningless. Performers are taught to fear obscurity worse than physical injury. Breaking this deeply ingrained psychological dependency requires an immense exertion of willpower. It requires the victim to look at the billion-dollar machine that rejected them and actively decide that the machine is entirely devoid of moral or personal authority. Leavine rejected the conditioning completely. He did not spend his post-WWE years desperately lingering on the fringes of the independent wrestling circuit, wrestling for meager pay in high school gymnasiums in a tragic attempt to recapture the fading echo of his television fame. He did not leverage his status as a former Tough Enough winner to solicit bookings or sell autographs at conventions. He recognized that continuing to orbit the industry that had exploited him would only prolong the trauma. He severed the cord entirely. He transitioned into a realm defined by tangible, quiet value. Andy Leavine became a schoolteacher. The contrast between his former occupation and his current reality is absolute. The World Wrestling Entertainment business model is purely extractive. It identifies vulnerable, aspiring talent, places them in a high-pressure environment, extracts their physical energy and emotional distress for television content, monetizes that content, and discards the human remains. The profession of education operates on the exact inverse principle. It is an investment of energy and knowledge into the next generation, designed to build capable, independent individuals without the expectation of global applause. Within the walls of his classroom, Leavine enforces a strict boundary regarding his past. In an era where minor internet celebrity is often leveraged for social currency, Leavine actively conceals his history as a national television reality show winner and professional wrestler from his students. If a student discovers the old footage of his Tough Enough victory or his brief appearances on WWE programming, he minimizes the conversation and swiftly redirects their attention. Driven by a highly sophisticated and necessary defense mechanism, rather than a false sense of humility, he actively conceals his past. Leavine has stated in subsequent rare interviews that he views his time in the professional wrestling industry as a profoundly toxic era of his life. He refuses to glorify the experience for his students. He understands that teenagers are highly susceptible to the intoxicating illusion of fame. By refusing to leverage his wrestling past as a badge of honor, he refuses to act as a recruiter for the very corporate meat grinder that consumed his early 20s. He protects his students from the illusion by actively denying its value. The ultimate measure of Leavine's recovery is found in the specific message he now directs toward the next generation of athletes who find themselves seduced by the blinding lights of the entertainment industry. His advice completely dismantles the psychological trap utilized by the promoters. He does not offer hollow platitudes about working harder or ignoring the critics. He attacks the foundational lie of the business. He tells young athletes clearly and forcefully that they possess inherent value and profound importance entirely outside the confines of a wrestling ring or a television screen. He emphasizes that they do not need the machine to validate their existence, and they certainly do not need to sacrifice their physical health, their financial stability, or their human dignity to satisfy the arbitrary demands of a billionaire executive board. This message is the antidote to the tough enough poison. It strips the corporation of its perceived omnipotence. It exposes the reality that the wrestling industry is not a magical kingdom granting dreams. It is simply an unregulated, highly aggressive content factory that relies on the desperation of its independent contractors to function. The narrative arc of Andy Leavine is a definitive, unvarnished exposure of the reality television apparatus. The corporation designed a trap, baited it with the promise of global superstardom, and utilized a 23-year-old athlete to generate massive viewer engagement. They branded him, forced him into a biologically devastating physical standard, slapped him across the face on live television to assert their dominance, isolated him financially under the guise of a hypocritical wellness policy, and then exiled him to a Caribbean island until the public forgot his name. The machine operated exactly as it was designed to operate. However, the final outcome of the story represents a catastrophic failure of the corporate conditioning. The executives intended to leave behind a broken, desperate former athlete, forever chasing the spotlight they had briefly permitted him to stand in. Instead, they inadvertently forged an individual completely immune to their manipulation. Andy Leavine's ultimate victory did not occur in June 2011 when the confetti fell in Richmond, Virginia. That was merely the moment the trap snapped shut. His true victory occurred in the quiet, undocumented years that followed his release. He won by refusing to let his corporate termination define his human worth. He won by recognizing the profound toxicity of the environment, shedding the physical and psychological damage, and walking away without looking back. The story of the silent rage is a permanent warning regarding the extreme dangers of manufactured fame. It proves that the most courageous act an individual can perform when trapped inside a systemic, abusive corporate hierarchy is not to fight for a better position within the cage. The most courageous act is to recognize the illusion, step out of the spotlight, and build a meaningful life in the quiet dignity of the real world.